All right, good morning, everybody. So today I kind of want to talk about something that definitely is transit related and related to railroads and sustainability. Not really directly urbanism stuff, but it is something that is talked about in the urbanism field. Now, as a disclaimer, I am an aerospace engineer and I have worked on aircraft before and have designed aircraft, so I think I have a little bit of a reason to get into this. And we'll see how deep I dive into my aerospace rabbit hole. But I want to talk about, airlines and airlines' goals of net zero and decarbonization and kind of the difficulties that the aviation industry is going to face. First of all, we need to acknowledge how heavily subsidized the aviation industry is, both in terms of R&D and municipalities helping fund the construction of airports. Also government contracts with Boeing and Lockheed Martin, which definitely help ease their operational woes. Even if, they might get a contract to build a fighter aircraft, but it definitely helps the bottom line where, they can have a facility that makes components for both civilian airliners and jet-powered military aircraft. So, from a financial perspective, you need to understand that both the airports and the airlines and the aviation manufacturers all get some nice government cheese here and there. So, this isn't the free market deciding what forms of transit we want to have in this country. This is other forces beyond our control as, voting with our wallets that determine whether or not we will or will not have air power in this country, whether it be for civilian or military use. We definitely bet the country on airplanes and roads. In the 1950s and 60s, we divested from our rail infrastructure and threw it all on airports, airplanes, highways, roads, and cars. So we definitely were picking winners and losers back in the 50s and 60s. And now we are kind of dealing with the nasty side effects of picking winners and losers. Basically, what if we bet on the wrong horse? But still, the airlines in particular, there are very few people that have a, friendly view of the airlines. Typically, we all have our own horror stories about how the airlines have really screwed up a trip or basically robbed you blind in one way or another. All the fees, how an airline can cancel at the last minute and just say, up yours, pal, but you want to cancel the flight and they basically take the money and run. So we all have our horror stories with airlines, and I don't really want to spend much time talking about that. I just want to establish that it's not like the public perception of the aviation industry and the airline industry is very rosy, and we really are championing them and saying, oh, they're really trying hard and they're doing their best, and they're they try to be right by people. I doubt many people would agree that the aviation industry deserves much sympathy or deserves a pass on much of what they do. Now, I am an aerospace engineer, so I don't really want to project this onto the people who design planes. It's mostly the people who operate planes and kind of the mannerisms and ways how these aviation companies handle them. Because you might have seen this before, but you ever wonder why the seats on an airplane never line up with the windows? How they're kind of offset? That's because the designers, like me, an aerospace engineer, those windows are designed to line up with the seats. The reason why they don't line up is because the airline, not the aircraft design engineer, crams more seats in there than they actually than are supposed to be in there. Now what they do is they make the seats lighter, and they rejig the floor, and they still get inspected by the FAA. So it is kind of funny how that is an obvious sign of the airliners, they definitely see their way they want to operate this airplane compared to the designers who wanted to operate it a different way, which is kind of sad. But yeah, it is kind of a not so nice world out there in the world of flying, both every aspect from security to the cost, to how even after all that, you're still kind of treated like a piece of livestock, funneled through. So flying is not a pleasant experience. I know that the rosy, nostalgic view of air travel is kind of like shrouded in myth, and some of that never actually was, but I would say that passenger satisfaction with airlines has kind of been in constant decline since, the 1960s and 70s. That was kind of the golden age to fly. And ever since then, it's just become more and more like, you could say that if the traditional perception of riding on a bus is like on the low end of a transit experience, and the high bar was the luxury of the 1960s, flying on Pan Am and such, where everyone flew in suits and dressed to the nines and had really good in-flight food. You could say over time, arguably, buses have gotten more comfortable and planes have gotten less comfortable, which is kind of funny. So all of this is a roundabout way of me hitting on the point that the public sympathy for airlines is probably at an all-time low and doesn't seem like it's going to get any higher. The airlines are seen as a big polluter. They do burn a lot of jet fuel, and jet fuel is getting more expensive. So the quality of the service is going down. The public does not really have much sympathy for the airlines, and fuel is getting more expensive. And now the airlines want to decarbonize and look into alternative fuels. So is this battery-powered planes? Is this hydrogen-powered planes? Is this biofuel-powered planes? What is it going to be? And again, as with most things, the airlines will just pass the development costs of these new aircraft on to the consumer. So air traffic will just continue to get more and more expensive and probably less and less pleasant, because they're going to be building new planes, cramming more people on them, and then the planes are going to have probably very efficient and innovative designs, but again, the costs of those designs are just passed straight on to the consumer or whoever buys the ticket. So the aviation industry, or the airline industry, is in a bit of a pickle, because they simultaneously need to maintain a positive public perception, need to implement all of these new innovative aircraft that have yet to really hit the shelves, while also doing this with a more and more, I guess you could say, hostile perception of the airlines, because their business model just keeps screwing people over, and more horror stories are generated every single day about the aviation industry, and of course their carbon footprint doesn't help. But it's kind of like, how are you gonna generate all this revenue to buy and build all of these new airplanes while people are still, you're not exactly a very popular person at the party. So, you're going to be telling your consumers that, again, you screw over at every turn, saying, hey, well, airline prices are getting more expensive and they're going to be less comfortable, less luxurious. We're going to cram more people in them, so thank you for your patronage. And a lot of people say the airlines are too big to fail, like we depend on them too much. And I definitely think that where a lot of the other parts of the world invested in their rail infrastructure in the 50s and 60s, America invested in its aircraft infrastructure and handed out a lot of nice subsidies to airports and aircraft manufacturers. And now we're going to be regretting doing all that, because now we're really behind the eight ball with our rail infrastructure, which is kind of funny. And again, we bet on the wrong horse. So, what's going to happen is that, the government's probably going to hand out massive subsidies to both airlines and aircraft manufacturers to both buy, build, and design, or design, build, and buy, I guess you could say, if it's in the correct order, all these new fancy aircraft, which again is, more taxpayer dollars spent on an industry that really is much bigger than it needs to be. and more expensive ticket prices for all of us. And as a parallel to rail, it's like, well, we didn't invest in our rail. We did invest in our airplanes. And now we're in the position where like we're going to invest more in our airplanes to create, again, a very expensive future for aircraft travel. And it's just something we need to think about. Now, again, there are things that aircraft can do that trains and cars and boats can't, such as, getting across the Atlantic in a reasonable time frame. And I think that we as a society will probably all end up agreeing that, yes, we all do enjoy the ability to get from New York to London in a reasonable time frame. Now, the question is that with the aircraft of the future, is that going to be faster or slower? You see things like boom and supersonic developments, which are dependent on very high octane, or not necessarily high octane, but high BTU or BTU dense fuels like JP85, and sometimes even some other special concoctions for supersonic aircraft. So, we've got companies trying to build supersonic aircraft, of which, the reason why supersonic aircraft died out in the first place was because fuel got too expensive. And now, we're in another, history's kind of repeating itself where, they might build a more efficient supersonic aircraft, but still, to go that fast requires energy. The question is, are we still going to have, how affordable will the ticket be? With the design costs of building an entirely new supersonic aircraft and the rising fuel prices, both in terms of, supply and demand, and also as governments put more taxes and fees onto fuel. It's like you might be able to build the plane, but is anyone going to be able to afford to fly it? So some people say that like the fastest era of civilian flight is behind us if we exclude the future of civilian space flight. Which is, as an aerospace engineer, I mean, I know enough to not, it doesn't really bother me as much because I'm both an aerospace engineer and a pretty staunch environmentalist. So, I can definitely see the hubris and people wanting to get everywhere as quickly as possible and saying, well, as a society on a finite planet with finite resources, spending twice as much fuel to get someone from New York to London in 4 hours instead of 8 hours. Do we really need to be doing that? I mean, it's more of just because you can doesn't mean you should. But the question is that are the aircraft of the future, for people who aren't booking a supersonic plane ticket, if that ever becomes viable again, are trips between New York and London going to get slower as maybe these new eco-designed biofuel, synthetic fuel, hydrogen-powered planes might travel slower than what we have right now, because they're going to be trying to find that sweet spot of efficiency, which is kind of interesting to think about. As a compromise, let's say, yes, we can build a plane that can run on a lower grade biofuel or synthetic fuel that doesn't have as many BTUs, British thermal units, or the energy density of the fuel is lower than that of a hydrocarbon-based fuel that came out of the ground. I mean, technically, yes, biofuels are hydrocarbons, but they are not petroleum. They are not fossil fuels. They are synthesized out of water, air, carbon dioxide, methane, ethanol, biodiesel. The idea is that they are a renewable fuel. You can build the fuel. And really, biofuel should be looked at kind of like energy storage. Just like a battery where you charge up a battery and say you've got a 100 amp hour, 12 volt battery. To charge it up, you might actually put, 120 amp hours into it, but you're only ever going to get 100 amp hours out of it. If you use it immediately, and if you let it sit on a shelf for a month, you might only get 90 amp hours out of it. And biofuels are kind of the same way, where it takes more energy to make a biofuel than you get out of the biofuel. So, for instance, if you're creating a synthetic jet fuel, it might take, you might have to put, say, 2.5 gallons of jet fuel energy into creating 1 gallon of synthetic jet fuel. Now that energy would hopefully be electricity and come from a renewable source. So you take, twice as much or 2.5 times as much energy, no matter what form it's in, to create, kind of 1 unit of energy that is in this synthetic fuel state. And what you're doing is, that 1.5 energy that you lost, that 1.5 units of energy you lost, is really kind of the cost of convenience of squeezing all of that energy into a small, stable space. Because the benefit of synthetic fuels over batteries is that typically if you make, a gallon of synthetic fuel and you put it in a tank and you leave it on just in a warehouse, odds are, 10 years from now, unless there was a leak, there's still the same amount of energy in there. It's very stable. But the same can't be said of batteries, where, if you put 1 unit of energy in a battery, come back in a couple months or a couple years, odds are there's less than 1 unit of energy in there. Probably not 0, but probably not the same amount that you left. So that's why synthetic fuels are pretty cool, because if you can use surplus green energy, or maybe not even surplus, but just green energy to help synthesize your fuel, well, then you can have a huge stockpile of it, which doubles it as energy storage, versus batteries, which, the world seems to have a love affair with batteries right now. And batteries do have that fundamental issue of they completely fall apart over time, and you'll lose the energy you put into them. Sorry, I'm getting really hot, so I'm going to try to take my fleece off. That sun is bright today. One of the problems of living in Colorado is it's very bright. And even if it's only like 49 degrees, when that sun hits you, it's definitely pretty warm. Trying to get my fleece off without taking my PFD off. A good rule of whitewater is your PFD is always the last layer that you wear. So let's see if I can do this. Probably get to see some bits of my shadow as I do this. Imagine once I get the sleeves off, I'll be able to figure this out. Yeah. Sorry, I was just like sweating there and kind of uncomfortable, so that feels better. Yeah. There we go. Fleece off. Woohoo. Much better. Now I can concentrate more. But yeah, synthetic fuels, genuinely, I'm pretty much a fan of them. I like to synthesize my own fuel at some point, but I do believe if you're building a transatlantic airliner, you would need a quantum leap in battery technology to do that, or onboard, some kind of onboard microfusion reactor. And good luck with that. That's very, a fully electric airliner that can cross an ocean. That's still kind of in the domain of science fiction. We might be able to get, electric aircraft that can go short distances, but whether it's a short-range regional aircraft or, kind of these unmanned urban mobility, aerial mobility aircraft, flying cars, basically, those are kind of silly, because that should be taken up with, if it's a short-haul flight, it should be replaced with rail. Whether even if that is traditional rail, not even high-speed rail, because if you can get a train up to 100 miles an hour for, a 200 to 300 mile distance, if you combine security on both ends and, baggage claim and all that stuff, a train, even a low-speed train, can beat flights if you're in like the, 100 to 200, maybe 300 mile range. That's also including, is the airport a ways out of the city? You've got to get to the airport anyway versus, downtown station to downtown station. Or again, might be a much slower train than an airplane, but if you combine like going from your house, driving out to the airport, which is, outside of town, going through security, then flying your 200, 300 mile flight to a neighboring city, and then getting out of there, going to baggage claim, then getting some kind of transit, whether it's a bus or an Uber, back to that downtown core of that city wherever you need to go, blah, blah, blah. Even then, like a slow train can still beat that. And once you get high-speed rail, then we can unlock the 400 and 500 mile range possibilities. And as well as those flying urban mobility, flying air taxis. That's again like basically just a Silicon Valley whiz kid's pipe dream. I actually was working at a company that was trying to build said thing, so I do have some insight in this regard. The aircraft, delivering packages, that's kind of a discussion for a different time, but the aircraft flying around cities, these quadcopters are really big, they're not drones, they are unmanned aerial systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, although they might become manned now that they've got people inside. But air taxis, like technologically we can do it. Like it is a viable technology, but just economically, it's a matter of like, okay, how many flights do you get out of one of these things before a catastrophic failure? So what's the maintenance schedule look like? How much life do you get out of those batteries? Because typically these air taxis are using lithium polymer batteries because those have the best energy density, but they also got the shortest lifespan. Even if they technically do have a good lifespan, they'll puff up and overheat. And so the question is like, okay, how many like the big thing I found when I was working on UAVs like this is that, you'd have to replace the batteries, at the most life I've ever seen out of one set of batteries was maybe 100 flights. After 100 flights, you had to replace the entire battery pack. Like the battery pack might still work, but it started to puff up. It started to degrade to the point that it didn't have the power and energy density that we needed. Like the capacity was reduced, and then the C rating, which is like how fast it can discharge. We were noticing that the battery pack was getting old and tired, and it couldn't release the same amount of energy. So, if you have this flying air taxi, like okay, it's got moving parts, it's got rotors, so there's going to be a maintenance schedule, kind of like helicopters, where every day in the air is a day in the shop. So with these UAVs, could you imagine like a taxi service saying like for every day that a taxi needs to be on the road is a day in the shop, and you can only do 100 trips before you basically have to replace the engine, which in a UAV you should basically consider the battery to be the engine. The motors are pretty darn good and pretty efficient. The motors still overheat, but the ESCs as well, the electric speed controllers, those things can blow out too. So a lot of these UAVs and USs have redundant systems because of how often a rotor will blow or an ESC will blow, which again, works the system even harder, which can even shorten the lifetime of those components. So when it comes to unmanned aerial mobility or autonomous aerial air taxis flying around Manhattan or Paris or whatever, nothing's ever going to fly over Paris. I know about their rule. But still, like this idea of like, we don't need to build public transit. We don't need to have buses. We don't need to have trains and trolleys and trams. We just need to have all these air taxis that'll whisk you away. Well, it's like, well, those, again, where let's say the thing works perfectly before I go into all the reasons why it won't work. Let's say the thing works perfectly and you've got like various aeroports. They're not airports, they're aeroports because it has to sound future and fancy. Like how many of them are they're going to be in Manhattan? Are they going to be on rooftops? Are they going to be in parks? So even once you fly from point A to point B, it's not like the things are landing right outside your doorstep in the way how a taxi, a bus, or if you're lucky, a tram could. So odds are, it's a very low capacity gadget bond form of transit, which will probably be very expensive and out of reach for low income individuals. And will it actually save you any time? Because from one takeoff pad to a landing pad, probably pretty quick. But what is the proximity of that landing pad to where you need to go? Odds are you're still gonna have to walk somewhere, or you couldn't take a bike with you probably, so you have to walk or catch a bus or catch a train or an Uber or a taxi to complete your trip. So you have to tack all that on from your, door-to-door travel time. They definitely look fancy. They definitely attract a lot of investment. But again, it's elitist projection. The wealthy, they have their private jets and private helicopters, and they fly from rooftop to rooftop in Manhattan. And they're like, why doesn't everyone travel like this? And they don't realize that they probably, spend 20 grand a week on their crew, fuel, and helicopter. something that's a bit unaffordable for the rest of us lowly schmucks. But yeah, autonomous air transportation in cities, kind of a pipe dream, because even if you could iron out the issues with the actual system, then, you're still, are we going to have laws that basically say, yeah, someone can land an air taxi in your backyard and you just have to deal with it? So assuming the thing's 100% safe and there's very few maintenance issues. But the other side of this is like, okay, let's actually get into the technical side of air taxis. Well, like I said, they do burn through a lot of components. How many revenue flight hours do you need to accrue to balance out the number of batteries that you've worn out, or the components you've worn out, or the maintenance schedule? Odds are the companies that I would imagine would want to run these things let's just say that some venture capitalist transport companies have very optimistic views on their throughput, like the Hyperloop and the Vegas Loop. And maybe they just, use their venture capitalist money to completely subsidize the project, where it actually doesn't need to move that many people around. It just needs to be a nice PR glimmer gimmick, which is great until a lot of people do the same thing, and then, the glimmer and glam kind of wears off. But yeah, it is a matter of the equation that needs to be balanced with autonomous urban air mobility is how many revenue trips are you able to complete before the vehicle needs to have a maintenance cycle and parts need to be replaced. Because again, these things are heavily dependent upon batteries. And it's not like an electric car where a dead battery means best case scenario, roll to a stop, worst case scenario, burst into flames. For these vehicles, you might not burst into flames when the battery fails, but you're definitely going to be falling on top of a city, which there are integrated parachutes on these things. But still, it's like so you're flying over Manhattan in your Uber air taxi, and you hear a warning sound, and the next thing you know, like the rotor stops spinning because the battery had a fault, and the thing starts falling out of the air. A parachute deploys, hooray! But now you're in an air taxi, in kind of an uncontrolled parachute descent onto Manhattan. There are buildings and people down there. Like if you land on the edge of a building or get blown into a building. Again, there's just so many different ways for an air taxi to fail. And it might be something where like technically you can like work out all the kinks, but legally, what's it going to look like if you go to a law firm or an insurance company and say like, well, there's a 99% chance that this air taxi will have no issues in getting from the destination to the or point of origin to the destination, A to B, no problem. I mean, the insurance company's going to say like 99%, huh? So, how many flights do you do per week? Well, to make this viable, we need, to do 1,000 flights per week, or however many it has to be for this vehicle. So you're basically saying like in 1 week of operation, this thing's going to have some kind of issue, which that 1% could be a minor issue or it could be a major issue. But what kind of scandal would it be, if an air taxi, deploys its parachute and then, descends down and lands on the observation deck of the Empire State Building and just sits there teeter-tottering while the person inside's like, please get me out of this thing before it falls off the edge and tumbles down, because that parachute probably won't redeploy if it's torn or if a thing tumbles off the side of a building. So that's why like the autonomous air taxi is kind of a dead end from the beginning of just like, it is so risky. And if you wanted to do an autonomous air taxi, basically hire a bunch of helicopters with pilots in them that can, that's the thing about the Silicon Valley tech bro whiz kid, is they think like an AI and a computer algorithm can do everything. They don't understand all the difficulties of aviation and how difficult it is to pilot a helicopter. I've known a couple helicopter pilots throughout my life. They're very sharp, and they've told me stories of like, oh yeah, that's the day I put a few more white hairs on my head because, something happened. Something unexpected happened, whether it was human error or a mechanical fault. And, helicopter pilots are pretty insane, considering that, a helicopter is nothing more than a collection of parts flying in very close formation. A helicopter is a bunch of spinning parts rotating around an oil leak. If something's not broken on your helicopter, it's about to be. There are various jokes about helicopters. Basically, kind of the joke in the industry is like, yeah, like there's 1,000,001 things that can go wrong on a helicopter, and we're surprised these things work as well as they do. But, in that kind of oh shit scenario, a good, do you want to be just stuck on there with the AI Elon telling you everything's going to be okay? Versus, like let's just say, like if I were given the choice to do a helicopter tour of Manhattan in an autonomous air taxi versus in a Bell Jet Ranger with my buddy Jace, I'd go for the Bell Jet Ranger. He knows what he's doing. And again, these tech companies, like, do you really trust Uber or Lyft with their very much so profit above all else, maximum throughput model to safely operate an air taxi service? You think they're not going to cut corners and, go easy on the maintenance and just say, nah, I'll be fine. Just get in, it'll get where you need to go. So, yeah. I probably could go into a lot more detail about autonomous air taxis in a much more cohesive way on a video at some point. It's just a bit out, I guess it's relatively within the scope of my channel. But air taxis, not the future, I don't think. But again, back to the airlines and kind of the public perception of like no one has their back. No one wants to have their back. They've screwed over a lot of people. They're not comfortable anymore, and they're very expensive. And the airlines have interwoven themselves into our society to be too big to fail. So if we are going to see a future where the airlines try to actually decarbonize instead of, doing what BP does, where they spend more on the PR campaign to tell everyone they're really good and clean these days than they do on their actual efforts to be good and clean, which I totally see the airlines doing, what are we going to end up with? So, to decarbonize transport, again, don't think it's going to be done with batteries, for airlines at least. We really need to, kind of break up with batteries. We're way too dependent on batteries. Until we have a chemistry that doesn't degrade, or at least degrades much slower, we need to really, hold back the amount of resources and time and effort we're pouring into batteries, unless it's into research of these better batteries that are lighter and more powerful and have higher energy density and don't degrade as quickly as the batteries we have now, the lithium ion and even the lithium ferric, which still degrades slowly. But lithium ferric is way too heavy to use in aircraft, way too heavy to use in most electric vehicles. The only vehicles that I think are using lithium ferric batteries are actually electric trains, which is again a discussion for another time and kind of a fool's errand, given that electric trains have the ability to use this thing called catenary wires, where they don't even need to buy batteries in the first place. But again, it's that whole, I'd rather spend 20 grand now than 200 grand upgrading this system, or let's make this numbers realistic. I'd rather spend $20 million on buying a bunch of battery electric trains than buying $200 million worth of electrical equipment, but then have to replace those batteries every few years, or you end up spending more money than if you just put electric wires up in the first place, which is the boot theory of economics. But yeah, let's just rule out batteries as a viable alternative for aircraft, because again, the only thing they'll probably technically work in is these air taxis, which again is kind of a dumb idea, or maybe a short haul aircraft, which should be replaced by rail anyway. And rail has a strong ability to compete against short haul flights. So basically the only aircraft that batteries would work in are both cases in which public transit and rail transit would completely dominate in those areas if it were allowed to, completely negating the need for these electric short-haul planes and electric air taxis, which leaves us kind of like, the mid-range long-haul flights for aircraft, which probably will never be able to be electrified. There might be some hybrid stuff going on, but probably not fully electrified, which means that we're going to be running on hydrogen or some type of synthetic fuel or biofuel. And that synthetic fuel or biofuel will probably have a lower energy density than the off-the-shelf JP85 we have today. Which is kind of interesting because that means that we're going to have to design aircraft that might have a completely different appearance than what we have now. There's many different ways how you can improve the efficiency of an aircraft. There's a lot of theoretical things like, the blended body or the ring wing or the box wing. Different ways how you mount the engines. There's all kinds of different designs that you can implement to make an aircraft that is more aerodynamically efficient and streamlined with a higher coefficient of lift or a lower coefficient of drag, to work in these lower energy power plants. It might still be a combustion engine like a piston engine or a turbine engine or a turbo shaft engine running a generator or a turbo prop engine where the engine just runs the propeller directly. But I do see a world in which aircraft are going to look radically different than what we have now, and possibly get a little bit slower to accommodate for the lower energy density of the fuel. Just it's a matter of economics at that point. Like, hey, if this fuel, costs the same, but has lower, if it costs the same per gallon, but each one of those gallons or pounds of fuel in the aviation world, each pound of fuel has less energy in it than what we use now, then the business structure of airlines is going to probably have to slow things down, which will be difficult because typically the appeal of airlines is that, well, it's expensive and it's uncomfortable, but hey, it'll get you there quick. But what if in the future of energy, we just don't have the energy available to get there quicker and things go slower? Then, the airlines are again in this nasty situation where they're slowing down their service while also having a public that is quite jaded against them. And they did this to themselves. They made the entire, they could have been, kind and amenable and meet you halfway. But no, the airlines for decades now have essentially just screwed over the customer and pocketed the money. So we're probably definitely, with the political climate we live in, we're probably definitely going to see massive bailouts and subsidies handed off to airlines so they can buy the brand new eco-efficient aircraft that Boeing and Airbus make. And Boeing and Airbus are going to get their own subsidies to help development of these aircraft. So again, the government is going to pick the winners and losers in this case. There's way more investment going into roads and air than there is in rail. And rail's like, hey, I can actually provide a comfortable, quick way between cities that's affordable. And they're like, no, I'd rather have an uncomfortable, expensive, maybe not as quick way between cities that's unsustainable with airlines and airplanes that had got massive government subsidies for their development. Which again might be a bit cynical of me, but hey, I'm just looking at what's happened in the past and how, these too big to fail corporations like the banks and the auto industry and the airline industry, this is how they've always played ball. This is how they've always done things. This is how they're always going to do things. But they are in a predicament of if they actually want to decarbonize or produce more eco-friendly airplanes, that'll be pretty difficult. Because again, the entire aviation industry, much like the highway system of roads and cars and trucks, all of it is only quote-unquote economically viable because of the access to cheap energy and government subsidies. Without the government subsidies and cheap energy, we wouldn't be in a land of highways, and we wouldn't have as many airplanes. I mean, we'd still have cars and trucks, we'd still have airplanes, but they'd be part of a more diversified transport suite where really the only we use the most efficient transport system we have for the problem that we have. So yes, airplanes would probably still dominate, flying across the country or flying across an ocean, but everything else would probably be handled by rail or public transit instead of just, throwing cars and planes at every single problem we have. And as a society and as a species, we need to start thinking more in terms of what is the most efficient means that we have to solve this problem. And we need to think in terms of resources and energy not just in terms of dollars, because I kind of coined this phrase the other day, but like, you know, what would I say? It was something, I coined my own phrase and I've already forgotten it. Oh yeah, it's like, you know, it's much cheaper just to let the planet die. That's kind of the attitude we've had for a long time. Like, it's just, the cheaper option is to, you know, kill the planet. You know, let's go with that. It's too expensive to save, it's too expensive to fix. I'll just make a lot of money in the short term. It's like having a wooden boat and ripping up parts of the hull to burn the wood in the steam engine, which is just kind of funny. It's like, do you not see that, like, yeah, the boat might go a little bit faster for a little bit longer, but eventually it's going to sink. I know you started up with boards above the waterline, but eventually you're going to be pulling up boards below the waterline. You're like, well, some water's coming in, but it's manageable. Oh boy, what a pickle we're in. But aircraft, yeah, at least fixed-wing aircraft do have a big issue there. Rotary aircraft too, heavier than air aircraft, are going to have an issue in the coming decades. The fuel's going to get more expensive, and say they do find some battery technology that is functional. Like, okay, how quickly can you recharge it at an airport? Are you just going to do a full battery swap to get the turnaround time you want? Because yeah, the energy to fly from London to New York, good luck doing that on batteries. But say you could do that, and how long is it going to take for that battery to recharge? And like the power cables you'd need, like, to actually charge that plane up in the time that you could refuel it. Oof, I mean, you're talking like probably foot diameter power cables going into the belly of that airplane to charge up its battery. Like, it'd be amazing to see, but probably the city and the airport's lights are going to dim when you do that. And this is like, you know, the people who are brainwashed to think that electric cars and self-driving cars and self-flying air taxis and electric planes are the future, and that's how we're going to solve climate change, is we're just going to have all this battery-powered automated wonder stuff. It's like, have you ever actually like sat and thought about thermodynamics for like a minute and look at what it would take to do this? I mean, yeah, let's write off the battery technology if we have like some wonderflonium battery technology that's amazing and doesn't use any rare earth metals. Like, literally you throw garden soil in a aluminum can and you get a wonder battery that has like an infinite energy density. Hooray, yay us. So we have this, you know, battery that has enough capacity to fly a fully electric airplane at the speeds we fly now between New York and London. Say it can do it in like 8 hours, 7.5 hours. Don't ask me how an electric propulsion system does that. Let's just say that happens. But energy is still energy. You know, the laws of thermodynamics don't care if you put a green leaf on something. So, you know, it's still going to take a bunch of energy to push a big airplane through that much air at that speed, covering that distance. So this plane lands in Heathrow, and, you know, someone walks up with or they don't walk up, a truck comes up with a power cable a foot in diameter and clicks it into the bottom of the airplane, because that plane needs to be ready to fly. And like, let's be generous and say it's an hour turnaround time, which is that's pretty unacceptable by modern airline standards. Just think about the charge time. Even like, say this battery, like, there's no limit. You can charge it as fast as you can. Like, there is absolutely no charge limit on it. I mean, you can hook up a nuclear reactor right next to it and just dump all the power directly into that battery. But now think of the infrastructure challenges at Heathrow. You know, this thing, like, Heathrow is going to start pulling probably more energy than a steel foundry to charge up these planes. Probably 10 times as much, because that's just one plane. I'm not necessarily a fan of the fossil fuel industry, but you have to admit one thing about, you know, modern hydrocarbons, that they pack a lot of energy in a small package that you can transport, which is probably why synthetic fuels are the route we're going to go, not batteries. So, best case scenario, we'd have to figure out a way to get a synthetic fuel that like can get within like 90% of JP85 or jet fuel, which is basically kerosene, but still. you'd need to produce a lot of it, and it would need to be near the same price. I doubt that a synthetic fuel will ever be cheaper than the fuel we have now. Maybe that could be done. And there will be hopefully massive wind farms and solar farms, hydro power plants, and nuclear power plants, which are powering these refineries and factories. If it's a synthetic fuel, is it more of a refinery or a factory? Or is it just a chemical plant at that point? Because refining something means you take something raw out of the ground and then you make it better, or you change it up. You know, a factory produces something new, and a chemical plant is specifically making chemicals. So we do have the knowledge and the chemistry to synthesize fuels. It's just a matter of like how much energy does it take to make that fuel, and how expensive was it to make that fuel. Like if it takes incredibly expensive catalysts and very expensive equipment, or rare specialty equipment that is maintenance heavy, and it's one thing to do something in a lab where you have a couple of chemistry PhDs with every piece of equipment and every catalyst they could ever ask for, and this is an academic exercise or a research project. But you know, to scale that up to how many gallons or pounds of jet fuel we'd need to maintain the aviation industry as we know it today, that's another question altogether. And that's a matter of like, yeah, we can probably make the fuel, but can we make enough of it, and can we make it cost competitive? Or at least, you know, where the fuel doesn't make flying from Oklahoma City to New York City cost $1,000. I mean, don't tell that's the other thing. Like these, you know, I can totally see the airlines being like, oh yeah, we bought new planes, they're super efficient, and we're fueling with this new biofuel. Now, this has cost us a lot of money. You know, support your local airline. Yeah, it's going to cost you $1,200 to fly between Houston and Kansas City, because we're doing the right thing by the planet. And I do think then people are going to look at it and be like, well, you know, I understand you just bought a bunch of new gear, and I understand you synthesized a lot of this new fuel, but is it really $1,200 to fly between Houston and Kansas City? I'll take a train once there is one. And that's how, you know, in the end, high-speed rail, morning, and regional rail will have the last laugh on airplanes, because even though right now it might be cheaper to buy an airline ticket to get between one city or another city, and it's faster than Amtrak, eventually the tables are going to turn where Amtrak will be hopefully fully electrified, and there'll be more rail options, faster rail options, more interconnections, maybe more private entities like Brightline operating around the world, or Texas Central. And then, you know, if you give them enough time, the railroads will run the airlines out of business just because they're more efficient. And it'll be kind of a role reversal of how the airlines ran the railroads out of business in the 50s and 60s. Because again, energy was cheap. We were in the brave new world. Trains are dumb. Let's all drive our cars and fly our planes everywhere, because that's what the founding fathers intended. Yay us. So look at the pain we're gonna have to go through to undo the mistakes of the past. It was convenient and it was cheap, so we did it with no thought given to the future. So, future of airline travel. Difficult to see them maintaining the same profit margins that they once had. Maybe we'll see a lot more consolidation. I definitely see a lot of ways how airlines can maintain profitability and financial viability is by consolidating their fleet, kind of going with the Southwest model, where they basically just operate one model of aircraft to simplify the maintenance. You know, all their technicians are only trained on one aircraft. So this future mid to long haul biofuel powered, super efficient ultra airliner, maybe that's the only airplane that is flown, which is sad for, you know, fans of aviation out there, because one, I do find, like an Airbus 737, you know, I'm an aerospace engineer, and Like the planes that I think are interesting are not civilian airliners. Those things are basically stunted mediocrity. I mean, they all look the same because they're all trying to do the same thing, and if you are all trying to do the same thing, the design's going to end up looking similar. You know, if you're trying to build a cup and you give the design parameters for a cup, everyone's going to build a cup. It's going to look like a cup. Maybe a different color, maybe it'll be a slightly different size, but it's going to be a cup. So I usually find specialty aircraft, not military aircraft, because I'm not really a fan. Although my favorite military aircraft is the B-1B Lancer. That thing just looks freaking cool. But still, not necessarily a big fan of the aesthetic of the jumbo jet, but I know there's people out there that will be sad when every single plane that rolls up to the gate at an airport looks identical. They just have different paint jobs. Because that is a cost that airlines pay of having a diverse fleet of aircraft, is, well, now you got to have, you know, all these different technicians and mechanics that know how to work on 13 different types of aircraft, or 13 different models of an aircraft. Where if they really are struggling to afford these new airplanes and the fuel to run them, well, then maybe they're only going to run one type of aircraft. And maybe airlines will say, we only run this version. Like the Boeing, you know, Skyhawk, Eco Eagle, whatever. And then some other companies like, well, we only run the Airbus, you know, Green Leaf. And these planes have, you know, specific performance characteristics that lend them to a certain market. Like, say there's a certain plane that really does well at like a 600 to 700 mile flight, one that does better at an 800 to 1,000 mile flight, and then one that does really well at kind of a 500 to 600 mile flight. So then you'll have like, it'll be funny if you eventually choose your airline company or who you're going to book the flight with based upon, you know, where you're flying out of, which is kind of how it works now. You know, a lot of aircraft or a lot of airline companies tend to have like their base airport that they operate out of. Like Southwest has Hobby, Delta has Atlanta, or whatever the Atlanta City airport is. I forget what that's called. The Delta hub. Yeah. But typically these are because like they have their, you know, HQ in the city nearby, or like they've got a big maintenance facility there. What if in the future it's less about like Southwest doesn't dominate Hobby, Southwest dominates every single airline route that's between 400 and 500 miles. So you only fly Southwest if you're flying 400, 500 miles. If you're flying 500, 600 miles, then you're flying United. And if you're flying, 600 to 700 miles, then you fly with Delta. That would be an interesting world to see, where, you know, you choose your airline based upon the distance you're going, because the fleet of aircraft that they have is optimized for that distance, which in the world of alternative fuel powered aircraft, with how slim the margins are, with the traditional perspective that synthetic fuels and biofuels are either lower energy density than traditional fuels, or it's all a finance thing, and even though they're all burning the same fuel, their aircrafts are designed to optimize at specific speeds and specific flight ranges. Thus, it's a financial incentive to fly that plane in the range that it was designed for. So even though, yes, if your plane can fly 600 or 700 miles, it still can, you know, fly anything less than that. But due to the speed and aerodynamics of the aircraft, like, that's really where you get your most bang for your buck as an airline, to operate those distance flights. Which is will be kind of interesting to see, like, you know, that theoretical future where, you know, distances are dominated by airlines, not necessarily airports. It's a very strange world that we live in. And with the rise of rail and the decline of short-haul flights, that means that airlines will be able to specifically focus on these areas. And in any business, if you're a business that is vertically integrated or horizontally integrated, you imagine that yes, the business might make less money overall if they cut out their short-haul flights, but then they can focus all of their efforts onto what they're really good at, which is those mid upper range flights, which you think would eventually translate in cheaper ticket prices for the lowly peasants that are flying on these planes. Again, that's kind of the Southwest model. They're kind of called the cattle coach airlines because even though they don't really do anything super long range. They typically are a short haul to mid-range carrier. But still, you know, everyone knows that Southwest is the cattle coach airlines. They're pretty cheap. And a lot of that stems from the fact that they only operate the 737. And they consolidate a lot of maintenance costs that way. All their facilities only have to be geared to deal with one type of aircraft. So allowing more airliners to, basically choose where they want to dominate, and then building their entire business model around that particular market. Yes, it makes them very vulnerable in case something were to happen to that market, but you're talking about cities that are a certain distance apart becoming, depopulated. It's like as long as you have two cities that are far enough away that most people don't want to take trains, or there is no train, inconvenient to drive, and you can get a good price point, but as long as, nothing bad happens to those cities, you could definitely see how a airline could say, we only fly planes between city A and city B, or cities that are the same distance apart. That's what we do. That's our entire business model, and we're really good at it. We have, specifically designed planes which are tweaked to, really do well at that range and at that speed, and probably even down to we know that the average, we have our statistics, we have our data, and we know that we only need a plane that can seat 100 people to get between these two cities, and we have figured out the most efficient way how to do that, so they don't end up, having a 200 person or 200 passenger airplane when they only need a 100 passenger airplane. We already see this now with how airlines are really trying to put fill every seat, because the relative weight of the passenger does not very much so increase the amount of fuel burned, even though they will charge you absorbently for your baggage. It's kind of funny. It's like whenever the thing is that when you check your bags at an airport, that information is relayed to the ground crew, who may say, hey, someone just put on a suitcase full of lead, put a couple extra pounds of fuel in the plane. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, because hopefully if an airline is competent, they will, keep track of how much cargo is on the plane, and make sure they've got enough fuel. Of course, there are margins of fuel and extra fuel on board in case of emergency. But still, the idea that every single plane leaves an airport fully fueled, no, they don't. Now, sometimes they do, especially if it's like an ocean crossing, but a lot of times, they only put as much fuel in a plane as it needs to. There's calculations you can do as the pilot, and the pilots do these calculations as well. Okay, we have this much cargo, the weather looks like this, so we're gonna have a headwind or a tailwind, and then we add our 10 to 20% margin of fuel, because the airline doesn't make money for flying fuel around. So if an airplane lands and it has half a fuel tank left, unless they're landing at an airport that doesn't have fuel, that's pretty silly for them to do. They'd like a plane to land with as little fuel still on board as possible. Sometimes in the order of maybe only a couple of maybe 30 or minutes to 45 more minutes of flight time if they're really working with tight margins. Of course, that means if you have an air emergency or you have to divert to another airport, that's tricky, but different airlines have different protocols. There are some standards that, at least some minimum standards that this is how much fuel you need to have. But so airlines love to fill seats because typically, having a couple extra people on the plane will not destroy that flight margin or the fuel margin, mostly because the airplane is the most significant thing that's flying. It's the most, your additional weight of you and your baggage is not going to tip the scales as much as the person at baggage, at checking your baggage says oh, you put one more thing on this plane, well, now we got to refuel the entire thing. It's like, yeah. Go cry me a river. So yeah, I can definitely see a world in which you have planes that are so specifically built for a certain range. Like say you've got one airline that operates a 400 to 500 mile segment, but they're routinely carrying 200 people per flight in the number of flights they have per day between those two locations. So they have a super efficient plane that has 200 people on board. Meanwhile, somebody else is operating a plane that flies between, like, say, 500 and 600 miles instead of 400 500, and they are only carrying 100 passengers per flight on average. So they have a different type of plane that's really efficient, and even though it flies further, because it's smaller, because it has less people on board, it burns around the same amount of fuel, or maybe even less fuel, because it's half as big, even though it's flying a little bit further. So the era of, airlines having to specialize to the point where they only operate one specific type of plane that only flies between, or is best designed to fly between two specific cities, that might be coming. And that might be the only way how airlines can remain competitive in the future of, now they're competing against more rail services and fuel is more expensive. Which means that we might see some really interesting designs coming up as these airlines basically tell Boeing and Airbus and Embraer and whoever else is in the field, like, hey, we need a plane that's like specifically designed to fly between, like to fly in this weather and this distance. Like it needs to do this exceptionally well and be the most efficient plane possible doing this. Which is kind of funny because, when you look at the RFP, request for proposal for aircraft, usually things can get very specific, especially in military senses. But for a lot of civilian airliners, like it's more general. And usually they're looking at like, we want to go as fast as possible and as far as possible. And now that might be like, we don't want to go as far as possible and we at least need to go this speed and we need to carry this many people and that's it. Which could be a really big boon for smaller aircraft manufacturers that might start to dethrone the almighty Airbus and Boeing. Where if you can build these smaller or more niche built aircraft that are really, really good at one specific type of flight profile, then those small companies will, do pretty well, which will be nice to see. I always like to see the little guy pull one over on the big guy because the big advantage of little companies is they can be nimble and small and they don't have to worry about a bunch of shareholders. And they just need a few little wins a year. They don't need some big juicy contract of selling, 500 737s. Ayo. So that'll be interesting to see if. When do you guys stop taking pictures? Sometimes in September. Yep. But that is something that'd be interesting to see is the little guy, pull one over on the big guy, because Boeing might say like, yeah, we could totally build, a plane that is optimized for the Oklahoma City, Houston city pair, but why would we? We're Boeing. We build big planes for lots of customers and we're really good at it. And then maybe a smaller operator, maybe Embraer comes in and says like, hey, we can build a plane like specifically that does that trip and does it very well. And it's the most efficient aircraft possible to do that. So I don't know, that'd be kind of interesting to see. Always championing the little guy, always kind of wanting to see the big guys stumble over their own weight. Because, too big to fail, huh? Government bailouts left and right, huh? Buying out the little guys because they struggle on hard times and then keeping all their IP but firing everyone who worked with them, huh? Yeah, I'm very much so like anti-corporate, or at least I like smaller companies, not bigger companies, because bigger companies just kind of turn into zombies that devour themselves and everyone else around them with no concern. And it's like, the number of people who work at a big company were like, I don't even know what I do here. I just get paid very well to sit around and watch a Zoom meeting every once in a while. It's like, so you get paid way more than me, but what are you actually doing with your life? Other than, I guess maybe you're supporting your local economy by buying a lot of Chipotle burritos and putting guac on them. Well, you can probably tell by me ranting and getting off topic that I'm about done with this here podcast. So hope there's something interesting in there. Get the gears turning, get the wheels turning about how the aviation industry will adapt to this brave new world. And And maybe we'll see some interesting, efficient designs. Who knows? Probably not going to stop flying, but hopefully we start flying less and find a new balance with nature. Anyway, see you later.